The night my son-in-law called me harmless through a closed office door, I didn't say a word. I just straightened my jacket and walked away. 4 months later, I walked into his boardroom wearing a suit he'd never seen, sat down at the head of his table, and watched 10 seconds of silence do more damage than I ever could have said out loud. But that boardroom wasn't even the ending. The real ending came 3 days after that, in a phone call I almost didn't answer. My name is Nathaniel Calloway. I'm 71 years old. I drive a 1997 Oldsmobile Delta 88 that used to be pewter and is now more of a suggestion of pewter, the color a car earns after 2 decades of sun, snow, and simply refusing to die. My daughter has offered to buy me something newer more times than I can count. I tell her the olds and I have an understanding, the same kind of understanding 2 old men have when they've survived enough winters together to stop arguing about it. I live in the same house on Birchwood Lane I bought 32 years ago, back when the street was still half gravel and the trees were saplings held up with stakes. My neighbor Frank, a retired fire captain, terrible at bocce, once leaned over the fence and told me I was the least impressive rich-looking man he'd ever met. I told him I wasn't rich. He laughed. I laughed. We talked about his tomatoes for 20 minutes, and I went back inside. I wasn't always this calm. I want you to understand that before I go any further, because the man I am now was built out of the man I used to be, and that man had absolutely nothing. I grew up in a 2-bedroom rental above a hardware store with 4 siblings and a father who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't always make rent. I started working when I was 11, sweeping floors after school for a man named Elias Rourke, who ran a small trucking company out of a garage the size of most people's living rooms. I learned 2 things from Elias that shaped the rest of my life. First, that the man who owns the company rarely looks like the man you'd expect. Second, that the people who ignore you when you're small are the same people who'll beg you for a favor once you're not small anymore. And you'll remember exactly how they treated you either way. By the time I was 40, I owned 3 trucking companies of my own. By 50, I'd folded them into something bigger, layered under holding companies with names that meant nothing to anyone outside a filing cabinet. By 60, that structure had a name, Ashford Holdings Group, and it was quietly worth more than most people could imagine, sitting behind an old man in a cardigan who mowed his own lawn every Saturday morning. I built it that way on purpose. No magazine profile, no plaque with my face on it, no gala photo. I've watched too many men lose themselves the moment people started looking at them differently. I decided a long time ago I would rather be underestimated for the rest of my life than change how I moved through it because people finally noticed the number attached to my name. Ashford is worth just over $2.7 billion today. I drive a car with a coat hanger holding the muffler on, and I wouldn't trade a single day of how I built it. Now let me tell you about my daughter, because she's the reason any of what comes next matters at all. Vanessa is 32. She is, without exaggeration, the finest thing I've ever been part of making. Smarter than me, kinder than her mother, and Eleanor, God rest her, was the kindest person I ever knew. Vanessa has a laugh that starts low in her chest and takes over an entire room before she even notices it's happening. At 8 years old, she negotiated an extra hour of television using a 3-point argument I genuinely didn't have a counter for. I remember sitting there thinking, this one is going to be trouble someday. I was right, and I've never once regretted it. Her mother died when Vanessa was 19. Breast cancer, fast and cruel the way it sometimes is. I raised the rest of Vanessa's 20s alone, which is its own story, one I won't tell here, except to say that grief either hollows a family out or welds it together, and Vanessa and I came out of it welded. 3 years ago, she brought home Marcus Reed. I want to be fair to Marcus. I want to be measured and give the man his due, so let me say this as generously as I can. Marcus Reed is the human equivalent of a handshake that goes 4 seconds too long. He's 37, tall, put together in the specific way men are put together when mirrors are a hobby rather than a necessity. He wears suits that fit him perfectly and a watch that costs more than my car, and he has a habit. Every single conversation, regardless of where it starts, ends up back at something he's accomplished, something he owns, or somewhere impressive he recently flew to. In the first 20 minutes of meeting me, he mentioned his MBA, his golf handicap, and a logistics conference in Singapore. He said Singapore the way people say it when they very badly want you to know they've been to Singapore. I nodded. That's wonderful, son. I watched him court my daughter for about a year before they married, and I'll admit, there were moments early on where I thought I might have him wrong. He brought her flowers on ordinary Tuesdays. He remembered small things, her coffee order, the name of her childhood dog, the fact that she hated cilantro. For a while, I told myself the arrogance was armor, the kind young men wear when they're trying to prove themselves to a girl whose father built something out of nothing and never talks about it. I've hired enough people in my life to know first impressions aren't everything. People grow, people surprise you. Marcus did not surprise me. He simply confirmed, slowly and reliably, exactly who he was. It started small, the way it always does. 6 months after their wedding, Marcus asked to speak with me privately after Sunday dinner. He had an idea, he said, a logistics startup, lean and scalable, something he'd modeled out on spreadsheets he'd clearly spent real time on. He wanted seed money, not a loan, an investment, he specified, like there was a meaningful difference in his mind between the two. I asked him a dozen questions about his plan. Half of them he couldn't answer. I told him gently that I thought he needed more experience running something before he tried building something from scratch. I offered instead to help him find a position somewhere he could learn. He smiled and said that was fine, totally understandable, no hard feelings. But I saw something flicker behind his eyes that evening, something that didn't match the smile. It looked like insult. It looked like a man filing away a grievance to revisit later. 8 months after that conversation, Marcus was named CEO of a mid-sized regional logistics company. Recruiting firm, 3 interview rounds, reference checks, a board vote. Clean as a whistle on paper. Here's where it gets interesting, so stay with me. That logistics company, Redline Freight Solutions, is one of Ashford's subsidiaries. 390 employees, solid contracts, good bones. Marcus got that job through what looked, from every outside angle, like a completely standard executive search. What nobody knew, what Marcus still doesn't know to this day, is that I personally controlled every stage of that process through a quiet arrangement with the search firm. I watched his interviews through a one-way arrangement. I reviewed his references myself. I approved his compensation package. I signed off on the appointment. Some of you are probably asking why. Why hand a job like that to a man who'd just asked me for money and gotten irritated when I said no? Because I wanted to believe in him. Because my daughter loved him. Because I've spent my whole life believing people deserve the chance to become better than their worst moment. And I genuinely hoped that giving him real responsibility, real stakes, might sand down the parts of him that grated on me. I went home that night, changed into my yard clothes and mulched the flower beds. Marcus texted me later. Big news. Just landed a huge CEO role. Vanessa's so proud. Hard work pays off, I wrote back. Congratulations, son. I put my phone down and watched the evening news, and some small part of me actually believed I'd done a good thing. I was wrong, but I wouldn't understand exactly how wrong for another 2 years. The first real red flag came at his company's holiday dinner, about 10 months into his role. He introduced me to a junior VP who asked what I did for work. Before I could answer, Marcus said, "Oh, he's retired. Vanessa's dad." Then, to me cheerfully, "Go grab a drink, enjoy yourself." And just like that, I was steered out of the conversation like a guest who'd wandered into the wrong room at a party. I smiled. I moved along. I filed it away. It kept happening after that, in small doses, spaced out just enough that any one incident on its own seemed forgivable. He'd introduce me at gatherings as Vanessa's father, instead of by name, like I was an accessory to her rather than a person in my own right. He'd talk over me at family dinners the way you talk over furniture. Once, at a 4th of July barbecue at our house, he corrected me in front of 6 other guests about something in the news I actually knew a great deal about, professionally, in ways he had no idea. I let him win the argument. It cost me nothing, and it clearly meant everything to him. Vanessa noticed some of it. I could tell by the way her jaw would tighten at certain comments, the way she'd sometimes squeeze my hand under the table like an apology she didn't know how to say out loud. But she loved him, and I've never been the kind of father who tries to talk his daughter out of love. Love isn't something you can argue someone out of. You can only wait and watch, and be there when the truth finally shows itself. The escalation that changed everything for me happened on a Tuesday afternoon about 4 months before that dinner in Brookhaven Hills. I'd stopped by Redline's offices to handle something quiet through one of my holding company representatives, unremarkable as always, an old man in plain clothes nobody looks at twice. Walking past the executive corridor, I heard Marcus's voice around the corner, mid-conversation with another executive. "Vanessa's dad," Marcus was saying, and I could hear the smile shaping the words. "Oh, he's harmless. Poor guy peaked early, I think. You know the type. Was probably somebody back in the day. Now he just fixes up his garden and drives that ancient Oldsmobile." He lowered his voice, but not enough. "Vanessa feels responsible for him, honestly, which is a lot sometimes. But family's family, right? What can you do?" I straightened my jacket and walked back the way I came. Harmless. Peaked early. That ancient Oldsmobile. I let those words sit with me for 4 months. I come from patient people. My father used to say, "Nathaniel, the river doesn't fight the rock. It just keeps moving. Eventually, the rock is gone." I kept moving. But something else happened during those 4 months, something I only learned about later, during the audit. Marcus had started staying late at the office, not for Redline, but for something he called, in his private notes, Meridian. He'd begun quietly reaching out to 2 of Redline's largest clients, testing the waters, seeing if they'd be interested in a new venture he was exploring. He was building an exit, and he was building it using every resource my company had given him. If you're finding value in this so far, take a second and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. The dinner invitation came on a Sunday evening. Vanessa called, warm as always. Marcus's parents, Preston and Diane Reed, wanted a family dinner at their estate in Brookhaven Hills. Preston, retired investment banker. Diane, a woman whose entire personality seemed constructed around the square footage of her home. They wanted everyone together. One big, happy family. "Dad, you'll love them," Vanessa said. "They're very warm people." "I'm sure they are, sweetheart," I said. I already knew things about Preston and Diane that would have made that sentence a lot harder to finish, but I kept it to myself. Then Marcus called me directly, which alone was unusual enough to be interesting. "Hey, quick heads up for Saturday," he said, casual, easy. "My parents are pretty traditional, old-school types. Might be worth dressing up a little. Nothing crazy, just something a bit sharper than your usual." I let a beat pass. "Appreciate you thinking of me, Marcus." "Of course. Just want everyone comfortable." "I do," I said. "See you Saturday." I hung up, looked at myself in the hallway mirror for a long moment. Then I walked past the suits in the back of my closet, the ones I wore closing Ashford's biggest acquisition 9 years back, and pulled out my plainest clothes instead. Clean, pressed, modest. I walked to the driveway and patted the roof of the Delta 88 twice, the way you pat the shoulder of someone you trust before something important. "We're going to a dinner, old girl. Dress code's humble. We've got that covered." Because here's what Marcus didn't understand, what Preston and Diane didn't understand, what nobody in that dining room was going to understand until it was far too late. I wasn't dressing down because it was all I had. I was dressing down because I wanted to see exactly who they were when they believed nothing was on the line. Saturday arrived quietly, the way important days always do, like they have no idea what they're about to become. The Reed estate sat behind hedges trimmed with the kind of aggressive precision meant to communicate a specific message. A young valet gave the Olds a long look, then a longer one at me. "I can take your car around, sir," he said, recovering fast. "Thank you, son. She pulls left. Don't let it worry you." Preston opened the door before I could knock. Tall, silver-haired, 73, dressed in that expensive casual way rich men wear at home. His handshake lasted exactly as long as required, and not a second more. Diane appeared, elegant and precise, and took both my hands in hers the way people do when they want physical contact to fill in for sincerity. "We've heard so much about you," she said. "You're just as sweet as Vanessa described." Sweet. First word out of her mouth. Not accomplished. Not interesting. Sweet. Vanessa crossed the room and wrapped her arms around me the way she has since she was 4. I held on a second longer than usual. We sat down to a table set with deliberate formality. Crystal glasses, heavy silverware, candles that looked like they'd never been lit before, and likely never would be again. Preston led the conversation the way men like Preston always do, loudly from the front, with the confidence of someone who's never once been told he talks too much. He spoke about the markets, a recent trip to the Amalfi Coast, and Marcus's extraordinary instincts running Redline. That boy transformed that company, Preston said, swirling his glass. The board respects him enormously. Leadership's in the blood, I think. He glanced at me, brief and pointed, the kind of look designed to draw a contrast without saying it out loud. I nodded appreciatively. That's wonderful. You must be proud. Then Diane turned to Vanessa with a very particular smile. And Vanessa, you must feel so secure having a husband who provides so well. Such a blessing. Not every girl's so lucky. The table went quiet for a fraction of a second. Vanessa smiled graciously, but I saw her eyes. I saw them. I picked up my water and took a slow sip, said absolutely nothing, and waited. The folder hadn't arrived yet. It arrived with dessert. Preston reached under his chair, set a leather folder on the table, smoothed it once with his palm, and slid it toward me. Nathaniel, he said, voice dropping into a rehearsed register. There's something we'd like to discuss as a family. Marcus has a vision, Meridian Freight Ventures, built from the ground up, the kind of opportunity that comes once in a man's life. We believe in him completely. He nodded toward the folder. What we need is startup capital. What we're proposing is straightforward. Vanessa's trust, used as collateral to secure the initial funding. Fully legal, properly drawn up. We just need your blessing, Nathaniel. As her father, Meridian. There it was, out loud at last. A name I'd already seen once in an internal memo I wasn't supposed to have access to yet. I looked at Diane, whose smile had the fixed quality of something applied rather than felt. Then at Marcus, calm, certain, already spending money in his head he'd decided was as good as his. I opened the folder and read every page slowly, deliberately, while the candles burned down and the clock on the wall ticked and nobody dared say a word. Then I closed it and set it gently back on the table. I appreciate the thought that went into this, I said pleasantly. I'll review it carefully. Preston exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath an hour. Marcus's shoulders dropped half an inch. Diane reached for her wine, relieved. They thought they'd won. I finished the evening warmly, thanked Diane for a wonderful meal, shook Preston's hand, full grip this time, eyes held a second longer than necessary. He had no idea what that second meant. I said nothing for 16 days, tended my garden, had coffee with Frank, drove the olds to the grocery store and back. On day 5, Marcus texted, "Hey, hope you had a chance to look at the proposal. Exciting stuff, right?" I waited 3 hours. "Still reviewing, son. These things take time." He sent a thumbs up. Phew. I set the phone down and made one phone call. Not to Marcus, not to Preston, but to 3 senior board members of Redline Freight Solutions, men who'd known me for years, who understood that when I call directly, it isn't social. Run the audit. Full scope. Begin immediately. Here's what Marcus didn't know. I had written his employment contract myself, every clause, including a fiduciary duty and non-compete clause I'd drafted 14 years before he ever entered our lives, built precisely for men who believe they're smarter than the room they're standing in. I'd waited 14 years. I could wait 16 more days. The audit took 11 days to fully document, and what it found was worse than I'd expected, even having heard the word Meridian said out loud at that dinner table. Marcus had spent 7 months building Meridian Freight Ventures on company time, using company devices, using Redline's client relationships to construct a business designed to directly compete with the very foundation that employed him. He'd approached 2 of Redline's largest clients, using internal pricing data he had no authorization to share externally. He'd recruited one of Redline's senior operations managers to join him the moment he launched, promising her a partnership stake funded by money he intended to secure from my daughter's inheritance. And there was one more detail, buried in an email thread the forensic team flagged near the end of the report. An email from Marcus to Preston, dated 3 weeks before the Brookhaven dinner, where he wrote, "Once we get the trust unlocked, we won't need Nathaniel involved in anything going forward. He'll just be a name on a card at Christmas." I sat with that sentence for a long time, not because I was surprised by the ambition behind it, because it confirmed in his own handwriting that this had never been about building something. It had been about erasing me from my own daughter's life the moment he no longer needed my approval. I put on the charcoal suit from the back of my closet, pressed the night before, and drove the Olds to Redline. I parked in the reserved space out front, the one with a small plate reading Ashford Group, the one Marcus had driven past 3 times a week for 3 years without once asking whose name it belonged to. I sat at the head of the boardroom table, board members to my left, legal counsel to my right, the audit findings in a folder in front of me. 4 minutes later, Marcus walked in believing he was arriving for a routine check-in. He scanned the room, the suits, the folder, and his eyes found me, sitting at his table in a suit he'd never seen. I watched the understanding move across his face floor by floor. The interview process, the contract, the audit, his father's proud smile, the folder sliding across a dinner table, every piece of the last 3 years arriving at once. 10 full seconds of silence. I let every one of them land. "Sit down, Marcus," I said quietly. He sat. "I'm going to say this once," I said, "not because I'm angry. Anger is for men who didn't see this coming. I saw this coming the moment your father slid that folder across the table." I opened the folder. Redline Freight is owned by Ashford Holdings. Ashford is owned by me. Has been for 17 years. For 7 months, you used our resources to build something designed to compete against the very foundation that made you. And in an email to your father 3 weeks ago, you wrote that once you had access to Vanessa's trust, you wouldn't need me involved in anything going forward. His face went the color of old paper. "I want you to sit with that," I said, "because I have. The clause in your contract covers everything the audit found. Legal is prepared to pursue this fully if necessary." I closed the folder. "However, I'm not interested in destroying you. I'm interested in clarity. You resign today, quietly, professionally. Your reputation stays intact, and this stays inside these walls. Or we proceed legally, and every page in this folder becomes public record, including that email." He looked at the board members, neutral faces. He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked young, small, very far from Singapore. "I'll resign," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something real. "Good." I stood, buttoned my jacket. At the door, I turned back. "One more thing. The proposal your father presented at dinner, Vanessa's trust as collateral. My attorneys transferred it this morning, into her name alone. Irrevocable. A signature-only account, hers exclusively." I paused. "Tell your parents I said thank you for dinner. The lamb was excellent." I found out later, from Vanessa, what happened when Marcus got home that night. He tried to spin it, told her the audit was a misunderstanding, that I'd always had it out for him, that ambitious men get targeted by insecure older men who can't stand competition. He told her Meridian was going to be a gift for their future, something he'd been building for her. Vanessa listened to the whole thing, she told me, without saying a word. Then she asked him one question. "Did you write an email to your father saying you wouldn't need my dad involved anymore, once you got access to my trust?" He hesitated too long. That hesitation was its own confession. She didn't yell. She's not a yeller, my daughter. She told me she simply stood up, went to their bedroom, packed a bag, and left that night to stay with a friend. She filed for divorce 11 days later. Preston called me 3 days after the boardroom. I almost didn't answer. When I did, his voice was different, smaller, careful, stripped of the register he'd used sliding that folder across the table. "Nathaniel," he said, "my accountant called this morning. Confused about something. Our retirement accounts, the mortgage on the house, they're all managed through Ashford Wealth Partners." A long pause. "That's your company, isn't it?" "It has been for 9 years." I let the silence sit the way I'd learned to let silence sit. It has, I said. Another pause, longer this time. I had no idea. I know, I said. That was rather the point. I heard him swallow. Are you going to? No, Preston, I'm not going to do anything. I just wanted you to understand something before you call your son harmless at your own dinner table again. Some men don't look powerful. They just are. Have a good evening. Diane called 2 days after that, trying a different approach entirely, warm, conciliatory, suggesting we all let bygones be bygones for the sake of family harmony. I told her politely that harmony requires honesty first, and we hadn't quite arrived there yet. She didn't call again. I drove home in the Delta 88 the day it all finally settled, the engine clearing its throat at the first turn of the key, the cracked passenger mirror catching the last of the afternoon light as I pulled onto Birchwood Lane. I sat in the driveway a moment, just sat. 32 years of being the man nobody looked at twice, and knowing exactly who I was the entire time. I patted the dashboard once. Good girl. Then I went inside and called my daughter. She arrived 20 minutes later and found 2 cups of tea already poured at the kitchen table. She looked at my face the way she's looked at it since she was 4 years old, reading it like a map she's known her whole life. I told her everything, from the beginning, the company, the structure, the red line appointment I'd quietly engineered 3 years ago, the clause I'd written 14 years before Marcus ever entered our lives, the audit, the email, the boardroom, the trust transfer, Preston's phone call, all of it laid out slowly across the kitchen table between 2 cooling cups of tea. When I finished, Vanessa was quiet for a long time. Then she looked up and asked the only question that mattered, the one I'd been carrying an answer to for 30 years. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me any of it? I looked down at my cup, then out at the dark garden, then back at my daughter, her mother's eyes in her face, the laugh that takes over rooms before she even notices it happening, the 7-year-old who once out-argued me over television time and won. Because I wanted you to choose your life, I said, not have it chosen by what I own. I never wanted you to look at me and see a company. I wanted you to see your father. She cried. I held her hand across the table and let her. A year later, Vanessa started her own small logistics consulting firm. No help from me, no capital from Ashford, built entirely from her own network and her own name. When she told me, I asked if she wanted any advice. No, she said, smiling. I just wanted you to know I did it myself. I've never been prouder of anything in my life, including the $2.7 billion. Some men don't look powerful. They just are. And the ones who mistake that silence for weakness, who mistake that patience for ignorance, always find out eventually, usually in a room they believed they controlled, at the exact moment it's already far too late to matter.